You're in the cockpit of a P47 Thunderbolt, 18,000 feet over occupied France, and from up here, the world looks almost kind. A patchwork of green fields, the silver ribbon of the Seine, little roads like threads, the dark smudges of German airfields tucked into the countryside. The canopy is a clear bubble. The sky is a hard, pale blue. The engine's steady thunder feels like company. Your instruments hum, your hands are steady, and everything in training taught you that altitude equals safety. It's an easy, seductive thought. You feel safe? You're wrong. In the summer of 1943, 18,000 feet stopped being a refuge and became a kill box. What looked like safety from the ground open sky, nothing but clouds, was a trap, a wide expanse where the Luftwaffe ruled. Up there, the Americans were visible, predictable, and slow. Above them, German Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds hunted with ruthless efficiency. A slip of attention, a single diving ambush from out of the sun, and a Thunderbolt could be shredded before the pilot knew he was in trouble. Altitude wasn't protection anymore. It was a deadline. You could see everything and still die. Then the math hits. American fighter pilots are being slaughtered. Between June and September, the 8th Air Force loses 214 fighters, 214 gone. Men, machines, missions erased in the span of a summer. Squadrons that returned from missions had holes. Wingmen vanished. Air tactics that preached climbing to safety are failing in real time. Radios light with frantic calls. Mess halls grow quieter. In the sky above France, what should have been an advantage is turning into a meat grinder, and every new sortie feels like a gamble with lives on the line. Commanders start asking the unthinkable aloud. The enemy isn't some green squadron you can outclimb or outguess, it's the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe, men forged on the Eastern Front and in the meat grinder over Britain, flying Bf 109 seconds and FAV 190 seconds that absolutely own the skies from 15 to 25,000 feet. They know every cloud, every sun angle, every trick to turn altitude into a weapon. These pilots aren't just competent, they're ruthless, fast to spot a flaw and faster to punish it. Up there, in that thin, cold air, American pilots feel the margin for error shrink to nothing. The German fighters climbed like guided bullets, faster, tighter, honed by years of war. Their pilots waited above in patience and sun, timing the lethal bounce. A screaming, blinding dive that turned altitude into an ambush. 1 second you're cruising, the next you watch a shadow and tracers rip through the air. There is no time to react. Then, out of nowhere, a Thunderbolt is blasted apart, cannon rounds tearing skin and sparking fuel, wing ribs unraveling like paper. There's no dogfight, no chance to call for help. One instant it's a streak of silver, the next it's smoke and metal, a plank of wreckage tumbling away. The pilot never has time to know he's been hunted. There's only the gut punch of sudden silence. By the time the formation steadies, one aircraft is gone, and back at Halesworth, that loss will mean another empty chair at the mess table. At Halesworth Air Base, Major Hub Zemke watches too many empty chairs appear in the mess hall, a blunt, stomach-wrenching tally of boys who didn't come home. The clink of cutlery and the rough jokes that used to fill the room have thinned to a hollow echo. Name tags sit folded, uniforms hang on pegs like absent bodies. Zemke moves through the rows, remembering faces, last radio calls, the man who used to laugh too loud at bad jokes. He feels the arithmetic of loss, not just planes down, but lives erased. The weight settles on him. He begins to suspect the doctrine he commands might be the cause. Back at Halesworth, Major Hub Zemke watches another place setting left empty and feels it like a punch in the gut, the steady, practiced rules everyone swore by are failing. The doctrine he's been ordered to follow isn't working. For years, pilots were taught a simple gospel: altitude is life. Climb, stay above, let the metal and oxygen buy you time. Now that gospel reads like a death sentence. Men trained to trust the sky are dropping out of formations faster than replacements arrive. It's not just tactics on paper anymore. It's bodies in the mess hall, and the doubt begins to feel dangerously reasonable. Hub Zemke watched the tally and felt a sickness. The rule they'd all sworn by altitude is, life wasn't saving them, it was carving them up. So he begins to think the unthinkable. What if being high made you visible, predictable, a sitting duck? What if every foot of altitude was a sentence? The thought arrives in a flash but refuses to be dismissed. It is dangerous, heretical, and utterly logical. To dive low is to trade one set of risks for another: ground fire, wires, instant death. But compared to annihilation in the thin air at 18,000 feet, it might be the only chance to keep men alive. It sounds insane, almost reckless. Fly low, they were told, and you trade the heavens for 100 invisible hazards. You give up the warning altitude buys, you become blind to enemies diving from above, to searchlights and fighters you can't see until they're on you. One misjudged turn, one patch of wires, one sudden flash of anti-aircraft, and the sky becomes a tomb, a P47, and its pilot a crater in a French field. Every instructor called it suicide. Every survival instinct screamed stop. But when every alternative is death, insane starts to look a lot like necessity. At low altitude, you slow down enough for German flak to track you, no speed to outrun the bursts, no time to dodge the orange puffs that bloom like deadly flowers in your wake. The guns are trained, the predictors set. A stream of metal finds your path the same way a camera finds a moving target. Every training manual screams the same line: flying that low is suicide. It feels absolute. It feels final. And yet, when the alternative is being picked off at 18,000 feet by a pilot who dives from the sun, that absolutism begins to crack, setting the stage for a question no manual can answer. Zemke stares at the ledger of names and empty mess hall seats, and the question cuts through the noise. Compared to what? Compared to the slow clinical math of altitude safe in theory, lethal in practice where a pilot burns off minutes before a single tracer finds him? Compared to plunging into the terror of trees and wires and instant death, where survival is a hair's breadth and surprise is your only armor? It's not an abstract debate anymore. It's about boys he knew, about whether obeying doctrine means trading quick, chaotic risk for a drawn-out death, and whether breaking the rules might be the only thing that keeps them flying tomorrow. He stares at the empty chairs, the casualty lists, and the cold arithmetic of losses until a brutal clarity cuts through doctrine. The gospel of altitude isn't saving anyone. It's turning survival into a slow-motion execution. Up there, they're easy to find, easy to pick off by pilots who climb and dive like knives. The manuals promise safety, the bodies contradict them. Faced with that mismatch, the moral calculus hardens better a quick, audacious risk that might let men live than the steady bleed of orthodox tactics. The thought is reckless. The thought is necessary. He decides to try the unthinkable. In September 1943, Hub Zemke pulls three of his best pilots aside, Captain Walker Mahurin and Lieutenants Robert and Gerald Johnson. He doesn't shout. He doesn't lecture. He leans in, steady-eyed, and lays out a question that sounds like madness to any trained flyer. They exchange looks. They've lost too many friends. They nod. The forbidden experiment begins. He pulls them close, voice low, and gives them an order that sounds insane. Forget everything you've been taught. On the next mission after the bomber escort is done, they are to peel off and fall through the sky, drop all the way down to treetops, to 100, maybe 200 feet. It flies in the face of every manual and every instinct. But Zemke isn't interested in doctrine. He's testing a different kind of survival. He leans in, voice flat, no flourish, and orders stripped of doctrine, skim the treetops. See what happens. It lands like a stone in a quiet room. He knows what he's asking. Ignore every manual, flirt with courts-martial, gamble with lives. So he stakes himself on it. If they hang for disobeying, he says, he'll take the fall, his career, his rank, his skin. That promise changes the equation. It turns rebellion into responsibility. For a long beat, there is nothing but the distant hum of engines and the weight of loss in the mess hall. Then the pilots look at each other. They exchange looks, no speeches, no bravado. Just a cold, quiet understanding that's been carved out by loss. Each of them carries the same haunted tally. Wingmen gone, empty bunks, names on a roster that used to be full. For a beat, they let the anger and the grief sit there between them. Then one by one, they nod. The kind of nod that's both agreement and promise. Zemke will take the fall if it comes. They don't need him to say more. The risk tastes metallic in their mouths, but the math is simple now. Do something reckless or keep dying by the book. The forbidden experiment is on. On September 27th, the three P47 seconds peel out of formation and shove their noses down. 18,000 feet collapses into a razor-straight line of sky. Altimeters tumble, wind noise crescendos, and the thunderbolts become bullets. Instruments blur, the earth grows big and fast. Pilots' voices go clipped, watch your spacing. Eyes on the deck because at 200 feet, there is no forgiveness. Trees are a green wall. Roofs leap up. Speed eats distance. For a heartbeat, it feels like falling and flying at once. Then they slap the deck so low, French farmers will later swear the ground itself shouted. They drop so low, French farmers dive into ditches and clutch the earth. At 50 feet, the world collapses into a smear wings, a blur, engines a rolling roar, dust and hedgerows flashing by. There's no time to think, only to react. Out of that noise and speed, the P47 seconds materialize over fields, a sudden, impossible shadow heading straight for enemy airfields. As they roar low over the German airfield, the Luftwaffe is caught completely blind. One screaming pass, a thunderclap of 50 caliber fire rips through fuel trucks, refueling crews and idle fighters. Metal and flame erupting in seconds. Men scatter, pilots scramble, but it's already over. The P47 seconds vanish before the first alarm finishes. No time to mount a defense. No time even to understand what hit them. In a single screaming sweep, the P47 seconds rip across the field, tracers tearing into fuel and metal. 4 F-Tura 190 seconds shredding into fire and smoke. The Americans are ghosts. They disappear before ground crews can even blink. No fighters get off the ramps. No anti-aircraft bursts. In minutes, the airfield is a smoking ruin, and the stunned Germans have no answer. A revolution has just begun. Zemke's insane gamble paid off. 3 planes turned doctrine inside out and walked away untouched. But this wasn't luck or some one-off miracle. It was the sudden exploitation of a blind spot so basic the Luftwaffe never thought to guard it. By dropping to the deck, they traded height for invisibility, not magic, but physics and the limits of German detection, timing, and reaction. Speed, surprise, and terrain turned radar, flak and command networks into liabilities. It exposed a brutal truth about air power and forced one urgent question. Just how exactly had the Germans been made blind? They had stumbled on the Luftwaffe's greatest weakness, an over-reliance on glowing screens and predictable doctrine. What looked like invisible safety radar networks stretching across France was actually a brittle scaffold. Those operators were trained to watch the sky, to cue fighters, to scramble at the first blip. But radar is a blunt instrument. It loves height and hates mess. Fly into the messy edge of the earth trees, hedgerows, rolling fields, and the signal dissolves. The Germans could see shadows at 18,000 feet. They couldn't see a streak of metal skimming the treetops. That gap, brief, exploitable, terrifying, was the opening Zemke needed. Radar didn't spy them the way pilots imagined. It sent out pulses, waited for clear echoes, and painted targets as bright blips in the sky. At altitude, that worked. Below about 500 feet, it failed spectacularly. Every ping came back mixed with trees and hedgerows, rooftops and rivers, an electronic roar called ground clutter that smeared and masked any small, fast reflection. Imagine shouting in a canyon and hearing only the rocks answer. The plane's voice was lost in the echo. The result? A P47 skimming the treetops simply ceased to exist on the German screens, a ghost sliding under the net. On the radar screens, nothing moved. One moment a tidy pattern of blips, the next a blank where a plane should have been. Below about 500 feet, the returning pulses drowned in what technicians called ground clutter trees, hedgerows, roofs, and rolling earth, bouncing the signal back like static. To a German operator, a P-47 crawling the treetops wasn't a contact to be tracked. It was a hole in the sky. No vector, no intercept, no time. The pilots weren't just unseen, they were effectively ghosts, and that invisibility turned surprise into a weapon. The effect on the ground is terrifying. A high-altitude raid buys defenders minutes. Sirens wail, observers radio in, flak crews crank up their guns, and pilots wrestle into uniforms. At treetop level, there's no grand parade of warning, only a sudden, screaming presence. Seconds. A flash in the trees. A thunder that hits before your brain can label it. Men who had time to brace now only have time to freeze. Machines still warm from maintenance are shredded before engines can roar. The clock compresses. What was once enough time to respond collapses into a heartbeat, and by then, the attackers are already gone. There is no time to scramble fighters, no time to man the guns, no time to even run for cover before the American planes are on them and gone. Seconds collapse into action. P-47 seconds flash across the field, machine guns opening like a switch. By the time controllers realize what's happening, runways are smoking and the attackers are already a memory. Speed and surprise do the work. The Thunderbolts streak in so fast and so low that every defensive calculation collapses. Flak gunners can't compute the lead on something doing 350 miles per hour at 50 feet time range, fuse settings all wrong. Bursts bloom uselessly behind them. Pilots are gone before anyone lifts a sight. In those seconds, the battlefield flips. The hunters are suddenly the hunted. The hunters have become the hunted. Right on their own doorstep, airfields that once felt invulnerable are suddenly open throats of fire. Radar blips vanish in the clutter. Lookouts have seconds, not minutes. Mechanics and pilots sprint from burning Fa 190 seconds as P-47 seconds scream across the field and vanish again into the trees. Panic replaces posture. Command lines frantically call for fighters that never arrive in time. The shock is not just material loss, but a rupture in confidence. The Luftwaffe can no longer assume safety at home. That realization births a new doctrine, one that treats the ground itself as a weapon and pilots as underwater hunters. Suddenly, the landscape becomes a weapon. Pilots stop treating the Earth as something to avoid and start using it like a hiding place submarines of the sky. They hug valleys, slip between ridgelines, and pop up over treetops for a single brutal strike, then vanish back into shadow. Timing, terrain, and speed replace doctrine, and surprise turns every field and hedgerow into an advantage. The P-47 Thunderbolt, built like a flying anvil for high-altitude battles, turned out to be something else entirely once pilots learned to ride the landscape, a brutal, low-level predator. Its sheer weight and rugged airframe, once thought a handicap at 18,000 feet, became armor against trees and flak. Its powerful engine catapulted it out of danger after a single, terrifying pass. Up close, it was merciless, fast, stable, and able to pour devastating fire onto unsuspecting airfields and convoys. What started as improvisation became obvious. This lumbering interceptor had found a new purpose near the ground, and industry would soon rush to make it even deadlier. They didn't just change tactics, they rebuilt the Thunderbolt. Republic bolted belly armor to keep tree strikes from shredding cockpits and beefed up wing roots so the P-47 could lug bombs and rockets without tearing itself apart. Controls and systems were hardened for low-level work. The lumbering interceptor was being reborn as a rugged, brutal, close-air predator. Most importantly, the gunsight is fixed. At treetop level, shooting is point-blank. There's no time for range cards or lengthy deflection math. You put the pipper on a truck, a plane, a train, and you squeeze. By February 1944, the P-47 seconds rolled out with the K-14 gyroscopic sight, a game-changer bolted into the cockpit. Paired with the belly armor and beefed-up wings, that new sight turned a lumbering interceptor into a precise, low-level predator. Faster to acquire, deadlier to hit, and terrifyingly efficient when a formation flashed over a target and vanished before anyone on the ground could react. Then came the K-14, a gyroscopic analog computer that turned the Thunderbolt's 850 seconds into a 14-4, deadly, almost automatic system. At treetop speeds, you don't have time to calculate lead. The pipper does it for you. Put the reticle on the target, hold steady, and the gun sight accounts for speed, angle, and gravity in a heartbeat. The result? Strafing runs that were terrifyingly precise, shorter exposure over the target, and pilots who could trust their aim when every second counted. That little mechanical brain changed low-level attack from frantic guesswork into surgical violence and set the stage for the April offensive. By April 1944, the experiment was no longer an experiment, it was doctrine. Months of near-suicidal practice, armor and gunsight upgrades, and brutal formation work had turned hedge-hopping into a weapon. Zemke and his men were ready. The gamble would stop being a secret tweak and become a full-scale offensive, and when it started, there would be nowhere in occupied France that felt safe. At bases like Ailsham, the quiet was deliberate training ground and pressure cooker both. Pilots flew the same drills until every motion was muscle memory, locking into formations so tight the wake of one plane was another's compass. 4 abreast, feet apart, they practiced peeling, covering, trusting because in the next phase there would be no second chances. That drilled trust, brittle and absolute, would be the hinge of the coming offensive. On April 8th, Zemke gives the order and 48 Thunderbolts scream down the runway, not to shepherd bombers but to stalk. Engines howling, they climb only long enough to form up, then bank toward France, a compact hunting pack. These are no escorts now. They are predators with one brief: find airfields, strike hard, and vanish before anyone knows what hit them. They cross the French coast, and then the formation breaks clean 4-ship flights, peeling off like knives. They drop, fast, 50 feet above the fields. The world compresses. Hedgerows become speed-blurred green, telephone poles whip past. The wind is a physical thing that slams the canopy. The ground seems to rise up to meet them. The whole airplane trembles. Pilots lock their eyes on wingmen. No chatter, no hesitation, precision or death. In that thin slice of air, they are invisible to radar and impossible to stop. Ahead, an airfield waits unaware, unready, and the P-47 seconds are already stalking the runway. The first flight screams in low and slams into the airfield at Evro 16 BF 109 seconds parked on the tarmac, refueling and rearming. There's no time for alarms. Thunderbolts flash over the perimeter at treetop level 8. 50 seconds coughing tracer into fuel trucks, wings, and cockpit canopies. Pilots sprint for cover, fuel tanks flare, metal folds. In less than a minute and a half, the quiet of dawn is shredded by fire. They materialize out of the morning haze, metal silhouettes slipping low over the runway. No warning, guns roar. In 90 seconds, the orderly line of BF 109 seconds is a tableau of fire and twisted metal. 11 fighters erupt into burning hulks, fuel and oil spouting like fountains. The P-47 seconds scream past, a thunderclap and then gone, leaving only smoke and stunned silence behind. They're gone before anyone can even get a round off. One instant, the field is a scream of fire and twisted metal. The next, a thunderous silence and a plume of black smoke where alarms should be ringing. Ground crews sprint, halting halfway as pilots fumble with straps and radios, but no one ever gets to the guns. The P-47 seconds have already streaked past tree lines and melted into the haze. It's not just speed, it's surgical timing. The strike arrives, bites, and disappears so fast, the defenders don't have a shape to aim at, only wreckage and questions. The genius of the strikes wasn't raw firepower so much as timing. The attacks arrived faster than the radio could cry wolf. German command froze, radios choked with frantic calls, controllers scrambling to make sense, so by the time Evro could send a warning, P-47 seconds were already hammering Bernay. Orders chased ghosts, fighters were vectored to empty fields, and the Luftwaffe found itself fighting minutes it didn't have. 4 minutes after that, another base is struck. German controllers hunch over blinking maps, furiously trying to vector fighters toward echoes that vanish before the interceptors can climb. Radios cough static and frantic coordinates. Pilots are sent spinning toward ghosts, runways smoking, then suddenly silent. Every vector becomes a panicked guess. By the time the fighters arrive, there is nothing but burned tarmac and the hollow echo of guns. Command is literally chasing shadows. Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's original guinea pigs, now leads a 4-ship that slips into the morning haze and crashes an FTW-190 squadron mid-briefing. They appear like ghosts over the field, strafing runs measured in heartbeats. Men barely have time to react before metal and fire take over, and the film from Johnson's gun camera will show every merciless second. Johnson's gun camera looks almost clinical, cold, metal framing chaos. One frame. Pilot scrambling, boots slamming against tarmac. Next frame, a BF-109 blossoms into fire, wings folding inward like paper. Smoke roars up. Men are sprinting, helpless, as flaming wreckage skids across the field. It's horrifying and efficient at once, no drama, just results. The footage reads like evidence, time-stamped destruction. In the debrief, the moment will be measured in seconds. The gun camera doesn't lie frames of men sprinting, wings erupting in fire, chaos reduced to stark motion. Johnson's after-action report is chillingly simple. Time over target, 11 seconds. Imagine that. 11 seconds from first sight to smoking crater, 11 seconds for alarms to blare and nothing left to scramble, 11 seconds that turned entire airfields into funerals before the defenders even knew they'd been hit. It wasn't bravado, it was a brutal metric speed as a weapon, surprise as ordnance. That cold number proved the tactic, and with it a new kind of air war was about to be scaled up. Johnson's dry line time over target, 11 seconds, wasn't an anomaly. It was the recipe. In April, the so-called Chattanooga Choo-Choo runs hit like a series of lightning bolts. 47 German fighters immolated on the ground, 23 locomotives turned into smoking hulks, and depots shredded until rail lines were useless. The raids were surgical and brutal, arriving so fast crews didn't have time to man guns or climb into cockpits. In minutes, entire supply chains stopped. What began as a daring experiment had become a wrecking ball against the Luftwaffe's infrastructure. Panic spreads like wildfire through the Luftwaffe's command net. Radios light up with clipped, angry voices. Base commanders in France send frantic, almost pleading messages. More flak, planes dispersed, immediate camouflage, anything to stop this slaughter. Telegraphs and telephone lines hum with frantic routing orders. Officers read reports aloud over and over as if repetition could turn the tide. At night there are no celebrations, only exhausted crews and commanders arguing over how to plug a hole that keeps getting bigger. The requests are urgent, raw, and panicked, an admission that something fundamental about how they fight has just been shattered. General Adolf Galland, Germany's fighter chief, stares at a map that keeps getting emptier by the hour, and for the first time, the math doesn't lie. Losing whole squadrons on the ground is not a series of mistakes, it's an existential hemorrhage. Pilots, planes, and precious fuel vanish in minutes. Maintenance crews are exhausted, runways burned. This isn't attrition you can outfight, it's attrition you cannot replace. Galland feels the room tilt strategy must change, or the Luftwaffe will be unmade. The panic in the field becomes a command decision. The crisis stops being local and becomes unmistakably national. On April 19th, General Adolf Galland finally orders a brutal triage: scatter the fighter parks, blanket the fields with more flak, and enlist civilian eyes as an early warning web, anything to stop the nightly slaughter. Planes are hustled into hedgerows and barns. Batteries are dug in where they can be most painful. Farmers and townspeople are pressed into watch duty. It is a command born of panic, not strategy. A patchwork of fixes thrown against a new kind of attack. It slows nothing yet, and in a few days those dispersed targets will simply give the P47 seconds more places to strike. Galland's orders arrive like a desperate plea, but it's too little, too late. Crews scramble to move anti-aircraft batteries, but the P47 seconds have already taught them where to look. The hedgehoppers don't just hunt planes, they hunt guns. Repositioned flak batteries, hauled into the open, turn into flaming targets under a rain of .50 caliber fire. Worse still for the Germans, the ground itself turned traitor. The French resistance quietly wormed its way into the observer network and began feeding a steady stream of lies. A sighting here, an incoming raid there, false flares, phantom radio calls, badly timed farm sightings, small deceptions that looked legitimate on a controller's console. The result was chaos on the other end of the line. Fighters were vectored to empty skies, flak belts swung uselessly, crews sprinted to imaginary alarms. They scrambled after ghosts while the real threat slipped in under their noses, fast and low, leaving burning wrecks where their confidence once stood. Forced to disperse, German crews shoved their fighters into forests and barns hidden under tarps and branches, parked on muddy farm roads, miles from service pits and refueling points. What had been a minute or two scramble now needs tractors, tow bars, and teams slogging through fields to drag planes back to the runway. Ammunition, fuel lines, and mechanics are no longer at hand. Pilots must hike to distant strips. Those tiny delays compound into crippling ones. The result is brutal and simple. Airfields become collections of grounded hulks, and the Luftwaffe's ability to jump into the air in time is all but destroyed. Suddenly, the Germans are cornered by a choice with no good answer. Keep your fighters bunched on airfields where they're easy prey, or spread them out and lose the ability to launch a coherent defense. They try both and fail. Dispersal buys safety, but it wrecks patrol cycles, wrecks maintenance schedules, and turns air crews into a network of frightened, exhausted scavengers. Concentration gives you a fighting force until one hedgehopper raid turns strip after strip into a graveyard. Commanders watch readiness timers slide toward zero. Planes exist, but they can't get into the air fast enough. The Luftwaffe's edge, its ability to respond, simply collapses. By June 1944, air superiority had calcified into something German commanders bluntly called air terror. The hedge-hopping P47 seconds had turned enemy airfields into kill zones, but flying inches above the ground brought its own brutal, banal hazards. Bird strikes shattered windscreens. Thin, nearly invisible high-tension wires sliced control surfaces and lives. Tree lines hid stumps and poles that could tear an airframe apart. Flak that missed high formations found deadly purchase at low altitude. Ground crews and pilots were worked to exhaustion, multiple sorties, minutes to rearm, while a quieter enemy took hold. Shaking hands, constant dread, the terror of dying not in combat, but by something you couldn't see. Then came the small, absurd horrors. Lieutenant James Goodson was skimming the hedgerows when a bird exploded against his windscreen glass and feathers, showering the cockpit, instruments rattling, adrenaline spiking as he wrestled the plane back to base. He got lucky, but the scare stuck. Pilots began calling birds flying flak with a crooked laugh that barely hid how close they'd come to a stupid, instant death. Humor was their armor. Still, the nickname carried a grim truth. The sky itself had turned hostile. And as bad as birds were, something even deadlier waited low over the countryside. Worse than the birds were, the power lines thin, almost invisible wires strung across the countryside at exactly the altitude they flew. At treetop level, you could miss them until they were on you. One moment the world was a blur of hedgerows and sunlight, the next a whisper of steel across your windshield. They could shear an elevator cable, rip ailerons clean off, turn a hard-earned safe return into a sudden, terrible scramble for the canopy. Pilots learned to scan not just for flak and fighters, but for a hairline danger that gave no warning, and that possibility haunted every takeoff and landing. They thought the ground held only fields and hedgerows until a hair-thin high-tension cable ripped through William O'Brien's P47 like a guillotine, stripping skin from metal and sending his cockpit into a roar of alarms. He had seconds to unclasp, kick out, and fall into the French green. Others didn't get that grace. Wires sheared wings, snapped tails, turned ships of the sky into flaming tombs below. It wasn't enemy fire that did it now, but infrastructure and chance, an invisible minefield at treetop level. These weren't spectacular dogfights. They were stupid, administrative deaths that ate at morale and left men wondering how you fight something you can't see. These administrative casualties were just as deadly as any flak burst or engine fire. A bird through the windscreen, a hair-thin power line, strung across a country lane, small, ordinary things that the manuals never mentioned, snapped wings, and ended tours in an instant. Ground crews counted planes shredded by invisible hazards. Pilots learned to skim the earth like ghosts, scanning for telephone poles and barbed wire as if every hedgerow hid a trap. You can train for dogfights and gunnery. You can't train for randomness. How do you fight a wire you can't see? That helplessness dug at them, deeper than any bullet wound. The toll isn't just metal and smoke, it eats at the mind. After months of dodging cannon and flak, pilots start rehearsing the tiny, stupid ways they might die, imagining a gull through the windscreen, a hidden wire, a church steeple catching a wingtip, and the thought won't leave them. Small things swell into threats, jokes grow thin, pre-flight rituals become prayers, a finger on a lucky charm, a checkbox done twice, a breath held a second longer over every tree line. They fly taut, scanning for invisible threads, feeling the cockpit close in, because the worst death isn't glorious. It's accidental, humiliating, and always possible. The fear of an honorless death didn't stay abstract. It settled into their heads and hands. Nights shrank to a few brittle hours. Mornings began with coffee and hands that trembled as they closed canopies or wiped sweat from the gunsight. In the mess hall, there was too much laughter and too many empty seats. Some pilots drank, others wrote letters they never mailed. A few simply stopped flying. The tempo of missions, 4 sorties. Sometimes more turned bodies into machines and minds into something thinner, more brittle. Still, despite the exhaustion and the creeping panic, they kept climbing into the cockpit. Less than a week later, they would fly at dawn. On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, the largest armada in human history crept toward the French coast, countless hulls and barges, black silhouettes against a pale dawn, hundreds of thousands of soldiers packed like cargo. Everything about the invasion hung on a single, terrible assumption. The Luftwaffe would not be able to interfere. Commanders had banked the lives of their men on the idea that the skies were as good as ours, that enemy fighters and flak would be neutralized before the first landing craft hit the sand. If that assumption failed, the beaches would become a slaughterhouse. The whole enterprise, in the end, depended on air power holding true on pilots like Zemke's P47 seconds, keeping the Luftwaffe grounded. Everything the invasion planners feared hinged on one assumption: the Luftwaffe would be unable to interfere. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was a strategy grounded in a cruelly simple reality. Hundreds of P47 seconds, the so-called hedgehoppers, had learned to live below the radar, to become lightning raids that strafed and shattered airfields at treetop level. They stopped playing catch-up in the sky and started punishing the enemy on the ground. By hitting early, hard and fast before controllers could vector a single fighter, the hedgehoppers promised silence over Normandy, and with that silence, the invasion a fighting chance. Without it, there was no plan B. Before the first landing craft hits the sand, 289 Thunderbolts are already screaming across France at treetop level. They come in low and fast, an iron tide riding the dawn. Engines howl, fields blur. Anti-air warnings arrive too late. For the men on those beaches, the sky that morning is not empty. It is their shield. At 4:45 a.m., 90 minutes before H hour, the attack kicks off. Engines scream, formation lines gasp into life. 289 Thunderbolts, hugging the deck, become a single dark wave racing east. Their orders are austere and brutal. Pin the Luftwaffe to the ground. Deny it even the breath to take off. They slice across moonlit fields, burst over hidden strips, and vanish before a warning can be born. Timing, surprise, and sheer tempo are the weapons. Coordinated like a guillotine, quick, clean, and merciless. So the German airfields never get the chance to fight back. They hit every German airfield within 150 miles of the beaches. The strikes were relentless. They came from all directions, sudden, furious, impossible to track. Out of the dim morning, the thunderbolts fanned across fields and hangars like steel vultures, strafing fuel trucks, rupturing runways, shredding parked fighters. No warning call could travel fast enough. At some bases, pilots were still on the ramp when the P47s screamed over none escaped. At one airfield, P47s sliced through the dawn haze and dropped to deck level. They tumble out of the sky, surprise, surgical and savage, and hammer a squadron of Bf-109 as crews frantically try to get airborne. In less than a minute, 18 fighters are blazing wrecks, destroyed before their wheels even leave the runway. The constant, chaotic sweeps leave German command centers reeling. Radar reports scatter, telephone lines light up with conflicting calls, and controllers try to piece together strikes that arrive and vanish in seconds. Pilots are vectored to ghost targets, flak batteries swing uselessly as enemy fighters erupt from the haze and are gone. What should be a coordinated defense collapses into noise and delay. In Berlin, the panic is personal. Hitler demands to know why his air force is silent, furious, and disbelieving, as his best pilots watch their bases burn before they can even climb into their planes. By 8 a.m., as American soldiers fought for their lives on Omaha Beach, the mighty Luftwaffe had managed to get only 2 reconnaissance planes over the invasion fleet. 2. Against thousands of Allied sorties, that paucity wasn't luck. It was the result of hundreds of thunderbolts screaming at treetop level, smashing airfields before controllers could react. The German command flailed. Pilots never got warning. The recon planes that did try to cross were spotted and dealt with almost immediately, a brief spark in the sky, and then nothing. For the men on the beaches, that silence in the heavens was as vital as the tide itself. Only 2 reconnaissance planes even make it over the fleet, and they're cut out of the sky in seconds. Anti-aircraft and P47s tear them apart. There's no mercy, no warning. Across France, runways become pyres. Burning wreckage, twisted metal, fuel-fed blazes, radios howl, pilots scatter. Bases that should have fought back are smoldering hulks before anyone can scramble a response. The Luftwaffe's silence wasn't victory so much as a breakdown, a machine run flat out until it seized. The hedgehoppers didn't trick the Germans into hiding, they beat them to exhaustion. Wave after wave of P47s screamed in so fast and so low that airfields burned faster than crews could fix them. Pilots flew with no rest, and ground teams answered alerts with the fevered efficiency of people who know they can't afford mistakes. Commanders could order planes aloft, but the planes, the men, the fuel, and the nerves were gone. The quiet over the radio was the sound of a force that simply couldn't keep up. Ground crews worked to exhaustion, refueling and rearming P47s in minutes, swapping bombs and belts like a pit crew on fire. They moved with brutal efficiency. Fuel hoses, ammo chutes, a quick systems check, and the Thunderbolt is rolling again. Pilots barely touch ground. Some fly 4 sorties in a single day, shed their gloves, gulp cold coffee, and climb into the next cockpit with trembling hands. Turnaround times are measured in heartbeats. Mistakes happen. Wires and fatigue kill as surely as flak. Still, that relentless churn is the weapon recycling planes fast enough to pounce on anything moving toward Normandy. They turn the skies into a highway ambush. Wave after wave of thunderbolts roars down to the deck and wipes convoys off the map. Trains erupt in flame. Supply trucks disintegrate into twisted metal. Even a panzer column, irreplaceable and terrifying, stops dead. Burning in the open, there is no escape. Anything rolling toward Normandy is hunted, strafed, and rendered useless. They strafed the panzers with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Shell bursts punched through thin armor, igniting fuel and ammo. Tanks burned, tracks welded by heat, crews stunned or trapped. Columns ground to a halt on torn-up roads and smoking shoulders. Bridges and supply trains were wrecked. Chaos and mechanical ruin stopped reinforcements cold. The attacks bought the Allies 3 critical days. When you stack the hours and the smoke, the math is brutal. On D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed just 319. Think about that for a second. Planes roaring from every direction, a ceiling of steel over Normandy. German airfields silenced, pilots pinned to the ground, command centers feeding on chaos. Those 319 sorties couldn't stop waves of troops, couldn't stop convoys from being shredded, couldn't lift the shadow of the Thunderbolts. In a single historic sweep, the sky belonged to the Allies, and with it, the fate of the invasion. Zemke's desperate gamble didn't just tweak tactics, it rewrote the sky. By turning Thunderbolts into hedgehoppers and trading altitude for surprise, he and his pilots ripped the Luftwaffe out of the fight when it mattered most on the morning of D-Day. With hundreds of P47 seconds screaming at treetop level, German fields were chaos before they could breathe. The enemy's fighters were pinned, their runways smoking, and the air over Normandy all but empty. That blank sky gave Allied soldiers the margin they needed to hold the beaches. What began as a mad experiment had bought time, space, and a decisive edge. The lesson spreads like wildfire. What started as a desperate gamble becomes doctrine. Between April and August 1,944 P-47 groups alone razed nearly 2,000 German aircraft on the ground, burned, shattered, and immobile before they can ever climb. Other Allied units take note, copying the low and fast tactics, the armor and gunsight tweaks, the brutal discipline of flying inches above fields and hedgerows. Air commanders stop worshiping altitude and start teaching surprise. The result is simple and devastating. Fewer enemy fighters available, fewer sorties flown, and a new kind of air power that favors audacity over tradition, forever changing how wars are fought from the sky. Ground crews counted wreckage by the thousands, supply trains twisted, convoys of trucks incinerated, armored cars left melted on country roads, tens of thousands of tons of materiel vanished, whole logistical arteries choked off overnight. What began as a desperate trick dived down, hit hard, and vanish proved brutally, reliably effective. Hedgehopping ceased to be an experiment and became doctrine. The new gospel of close air support, taught in briefings and practiced over fields and hedgerows. Pilots learned to use terrain like armor, commanders learned to trust low-level surprise, and the air war itself had been quietly, permanently rewritten. Its legacy endures. What began as a desperate, rule-breaking gamble 50 feet over France didn't die with the P-47 seconds. It became doctrine. Jets in Korea and Vietnam learned the same lesson. Surprise from the low angle, blunt force applied where it hurts most, relentless tempo to keep the enemy pinned and disoriented. Close air support stopped being a polite footnote and became a primary mission, striking convoys, railheads, and fortifications with surgical brutality while ground forces moved. Generations of pilots were taught to think in inches above the earth, not miles above it, and that hard, ugly innovation could win battles and save lives. The design philosophy of modern attack aircraft, like the A-10 Warthog heavy armor, terrain masking, and ground-level surprise, is a direct descendant of the P-47's brutal work. What began as a desperate, rule-breaking tactic in 1943 turned into a blueprint. Build planes to take punishment, fly low to hide in the electronic folds of the earth, and unleash a terrifying pass. Engineers and tacticians learned the lesson: survivability and shock over speed and altitude. And decades later, the A-10's armored belly, slow, deliberate attack profiles, and insistence on terrain for cover read like a translation of Zemke's hedgehoppers into metal and doctrine. Hub Zemke was never court-martialed. He was decorated. The quiet gamble that could have cost him his career instead earned him medals, orders, and a grudging respect from the very institution that trains men to follow doctrine. There was relief, yes, but also something harder: vindication mixed with the heavy proof of responsibility. He'd broken the rules and won, and now doctrine had to catch up. His decorations were not just metal. They were permission slips for other commanders to think for themselves, to bend orthodoxy when lives were at stake. In the end, Zemke's honor validated a new kind of leadership: daring, pragmatic, and indispensable. He wasn't punished. He was celebrated. Zemke's escape from a court-martial and his decoration became more than personal vindication. It became a banner. Commanders who once clung to doctrine now had permission to ask the dangerous question: if the manual is killing men, why follow it blindly? His name turned into shorthand in briefings and mess halls, a permission slip to innovate under fire. Bases rewrote procedures, junior officers were encouraged to voice tactical alternatives, and a culture that had prized obedience learned to prize judgment. That shift didn't just change tactics, it saved lives, and it redefined leadership in combat. He proved that the greatest risks aren't always taken in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moment, a commander decides to break the rules to save his men. Zemke's choice was not cinematic. No speech, no grand rally, but a private, terrifying wager. Keep doing what the manuals demand and lose pilots by the dozen, or try something outlawed and risk court-martial to give men a chance. He accepted blame, shielded his pilots, and trusted judgment over dogma. That simple, risky act rewired doctrine and culture, teaching armies to empower adaptive leaders who will bend rules when rigid rules mean death. In the end, the P47 Thunderbolt was at its most dangerous not at 18,000 feet, but when it flew so low it could feel the earth tremble beneath its wings. Down there, the engines roared like freight trains, trees flashed by, fields became a blur. The plane's bulk, its armor, its guns, its stubborn weight turned from liability into weapon. Flying that close was madness and genius at once, a concrete gamble against radar, flak, and invisible wires. Men paid for it with fear and sometimes with their lives. But in those tremoring seconds, with courage and contrarian thinking, they rewrote what air power could do. Zemke and his pilots dared to do what every manual, every instructor, and every instinct screamed was suicide. They ripped up the rule book and shoved their thunderbolts into the tree line, hands white on the yoke, eyes chasing a horizon that seemed to grow teeth. It wasn't thrill-seeking, it was arithmetic. Live now or die slowly later. They accepted the obvious hazards: wires, birds, ground fire, the risk of a court-martial, because the alternative was more empty chairs in the mess hall. That quiet, brutal decision separated courage from recklessness. In refusing the comfortable lie of doctrine, they bought a different kind of victory. By doing so, they not only saved themselves, but changed the course of the war in the air over Europe. What began as a reckless, whispered experiment at Halesworth became a doctrine that silenced an enemy sky and bought infantry hours they could never have had otherwise. Tree line runs, tight formations, and relentless tempo turned airfields into funeral pyres and left German controllers chasing ghosts. The victory was tactical and moral. Fewer boys in empty chairs, more convoys stalled, and a hardened Air Force willing to bend its own rules. Hub Zemke's gamble proved that sometimes survival demands you break the book and fly differently. They proved something bigger than a tactical tweak. In war, victory doesn't always go to the one who flies the highest. It goes to the one brave enough to fly differently. Breaking doctrine saved lives, rewired an air war, and reshaped how we think about risk and innovation in battle. That lesson echoed from France to Korea, Vietnam, and even into the design of modern attack aircraft. Hub Zemke's gamble wasn't just a stunt, it was a leadership moment that forced a military to admit when its playbook was wrong. Want more stories of unconventional genius that changed history? Keep watching, the best ones are ahead.